And it was a minute and a half until my next contraction came before the whole rest of him came out. And I just think that's so neat that, there was no pulling on him. There was no tugging on him. When he started to come out, watching the video, he did have the cord wrapped around his neck, but that was not an issue at all. It was just unwrap it. And he took a breath.
Hi, I'm Rachel, owner of the NaturalBirth site, certified birth doula, childbirth educator, and midwife's assistant.
And I'm Tiffany Muniz, certified birth doula, lactation counselor, and midwife assistant.
Here, you'll learn all about different aspects of pregnancy, birth, and postpartum.
Remember, none of this information should take the place of your care provider and is not medical advice.
Birth is not a medical emergency.
Thanks for listening. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Natural Birth Talk. This is Tiffany.
And this is Rachel.
We're so happy to have you today, and we are so happy to welcome our guest, Holly, to the podcast. Today, she is going to be Today, she's going to be talking about her surprise vaginal breech home birth.
Woo!
Yeah. Okay, Holly. So I think it would be great for you to just tell us a little bit about yourself and tell us maybe why you chose home birth from the very beginning, before we even knew that baby was breech.
All right. Well, I am 33 years old, first-time mom, and I knew whenever my husband and I got pregnant that I wanted to shoot for a natural birth. And that led me to finding a doula, which then led me to her telling me more and more about home birth and how natural physiological birth is really hard to happen in the hospital. So the more research I did, the more I felt like home birth was the way to go. And I made the switch at probably between like the 18 and 20 week appointment. But I went ahead and did my 20-week scan with my OBGYN and then transferred full care to my home birth midwife.
Awesome.
Yeah. And tell me about your experience, because since you did see the regular OB at the hospital up until you were halfway there, tell me a little bit about your experience, once you switched and kind of the differences.
Well, yeah. To preface that, I want to know, did you tell your OB you were switching to home birth?
Oh gosh, it's been so long. I feel like I did, because I was very good friends with my nurse practitioner I was seeing, because we went to the same high school. Okay. And I had never seen, you know what? She had gone out on medical leave. So I never told anybody. I just went to the appointment with the more natural minded midwife that Tiffany recommended to me in the practice I was going to. Mm-hmm. And then I went to that appointment, did my 20-week scan, and then never came back.
Really? Did they bother you? Did they call you to schedule appointments, or did they just never reach out again?
Yeah, they bothered me a couple of times, but I had to sign all the paperwork that said I'm transferring care, and I had all Maggie's information, Maggie, my midwife's information. So then I was confused why they were still calling me to make my follow-up appointments. Yeah. But yeah.
I was just curious because sometimes if you tell your OB you're switching to home birth, they'll throw out all the fear language and be super rude about it. And so I was just curious. So go back to Tiffany's question now, just kind of what that experience was like switching.
So I really loved my nurse practitioner at the practice I was going to, but obviously nurse practitioners don't attend births. And I was getting really personal care with her. But then whenever I was like, okay, it's time to start making appointments with other people in the practice, because I'm not sure who I'm going to see on my birthday, I was just not impressed. I was waiting in the waiting area for a really long time, really impersonal. I did have 2 instances of a subchorionic hemorrhage during my pregnancy at 6 weeks and 9 weeks. And the first time I got in with my nurse practitioner and she was lovely. And then the second time she was out and I had to see someone else. And it was just very abrupt and very well, this pregnancy isn't viable anyways, so we're not even going to bother. And I'm like, we're bothering.
That's awful. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, they were doing their job. They gave me all the information, but I also started.
But they told you the pregnancy wasn't viable, huh?
Yeah. And I already knew it was a boy at that point. And
why would they tell you that? See, guys, you cannot always listen when someone tells you a pregnancy is not viable, when someone tells you even if someone tells you, hey, you've lost your baby, you've had a miscarriage, get a second opinion or trust your instincts because they are not always right. Clearly.
No,
yeah.
Right.
And I guess they're viable thing was, meaning if I were like, if they wouldn't intervene, if there was something going on, like if the baby was going to go, it's going to go. They weren't going to intervene.
So they
meant
like you weren't to that like 23, 24 week mark to where, okay, I understand what you're saying. I thought you meant they were saying you were going to lose your baby. Like your baby wasn't going to make it. Okay.
If someone didn't have, if someone didn't have like a little bit of medical knowledge, since I am a nurse, I knew what they meant. But that's absolutely how someone without any kind of prior knowledge probably could have taken it.
Yeah. I mean, even me, I do have knowledge and I took it the wrong way. So.
True.
Okay, keep going.
So then switching to the home birth, I loved Maggie coming to my house. That was just so relaxing. I didn't have to stress about driving up, the chaos of Greenmount Road and all of that stuff.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
So, and my husband was able to come to all the appointments. Whenever I was going to the actual offices, my husband wasn't able to make it because of the hours and all of that stuff. So I loved it. My visits went from, an hour in the waiting area and, 5 minutes in the office to an hour with my midwife and not feeling bad about, my list of 10 questions every single time she came.
Yeah. And that's
I feel like that is right. I know we're probably about to say the same thing, Rachel. Like that's the best thing about having a provider that practices that midwifery model of care, just how awesome and understanding and how willing they are to listen to all of your concerns and answer all of your questions. And, you're not just a number, like you're an actual human with an actual human inside of you.
Yes. And the funniest thing is I had a note on my phone with all my running questions. So if I didn't get
I remember that. I remember
get my answer, or I forgot to ask Maggie something. Sometimes I would text her and sometimes I would be like, okay, I'm not going to bother her with this. I'm texting Tiffany with my extra questions. But the one question I never asked in my visits with you, Tiffany, or with Maggie, and it was the very top question on my note, was what happens if he changes position and flips breech during birth? I never asked that question because I said, why would I need to ask that question? Little guy's been head down the whole time. I don't need to worry about that.
So funny.
Well, and I remember at one point, Holly, wasn't he like a little oblique?
Yes.
Right? He was oblique and we did, like I showed you guys, the spinning babies, like stretches. And then the next week he was back head down.
Yep.
Right? Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know what that was all about. And maybe he was trying to get labor started and was realizing he couldn't make it happen head down. And so then he was like, bouncing up, changing positions. So I don't know. We'll never know, but that's kind of the what's the word I'm looking for? Theory.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Awesome. Let's, why don't you talk a little bit about your birth and like how it started, and we can just kind of get into it.
Yeah. So my due date was July 18th and I was 39 weeks and 4 days and I had my midwife appointment. Maggie was running late that day, so she didn't get to the house until like 7 p.m. on July 14th. No signs of labor. She offered to check and see where my cervix was at, but I didn't want that knowledge. So we declined and
because your cervix is not a crystal ball. Like it doesn't tell you when you're going to give birth. It's just curiosity that doesn't really even help curiosity because it doesn't really tell you anything, right?
Well, right. And then also if you hear a number that is smaller than what you think you might be, that can really mess with you mentally.
Totally.
Yeah. And I hadn't been having any signs of labor, no contractions, no discharge, no nothing. And so I'm like, my cervix is probably closed, so I don't even care.
Yeah.
Right.
So we just made our appointment for the following week. And I said, you know what, John, I'm going to do, the mile circuit this evening and just kind of see where we go. John is my husband. So I curb walked in my neighborhood and I did the stair lunging and all of that. And I just kind of laid on the couch that evening and watched some funny shows. Cause I'm like, maybe laughter will kind of, not that I was trying to go before my due date, but I wasn't really keen on going beyond my due date, even though I know the statistics say I was going to. I went to bed about 10 o'clock and about 10:30, I was like, oh, I think I have to go to the bathroom. I'm like, and I kind of feel crampy. But as soon as I like rolled over to get out of bed, I felt a little pop and I was like, oh, I bet you I peed my pants. And I'm like, nope, sure enough, it was just all clear liquid. So I'm like texting Tiffany, texting Maggie, and they're both like, okay, try to go back to bed and we'll talk tomorrow. And I was like, okay. I mean, my water broke, but I knew.
Because if you were still with your OB, they'd probably be like, you need to come in, you need to get induced, or you need to check in every every hour, 6 hours, or I don't know, or they'd be like, do all these exercises. You've got to get your labor going.
Yes.
Yep.
And I knew, like, I've been a nurse for almost 12 years now. So I had all of that knowledge. So it's really hard to get that medical model out of your brain and go with the natural mindset because it's so counterintuitive to our culture these days.
Right.
Right.
But statistically, it's safe to wait.
Yes.
But it's ingrained in everybody that it's not safe. But it is safe.
Yeah. And I mean, it was just the tiniest trickle anyways. And I knew, that there could be like a larger gush later and all that stuff. So I put on one of those, adult diapers and laid down to go to bed. And I thought, man, this is like some pretty intense period cramping, but there was no pattern to it. I click on my little contraction app and I'm timing them and I'm like, this is not helpful. So I couldn't fall back asleep. So I got back up and I redid my hair because I'm like, if baby's coming tonight, I want to look nice.
I love that. That's so funny.
And I tried to lay back down. And again, like I was already starting to kind of like low tone moan. And I'm like, oh, Holly, honey, it's not that bad yet. Like, I need to text Tiffany and let her know that this is not comfortable. So
that's so funny.
She gave me a couple of suggestions on like positions to try. And I came back downstairs and I bounced on the ball because I didn't want to wake my husband up yet. It was at that point, 1 a.m. So I bounced on the ball. I ate a snack and I was like, I'm going to try my hypnobirthing app. I bought the Christian hypnobirthing and listened to that all pregnancy. And it was so relaxing. I turned that thing on and I like wanted to throw it across the room. This is not relaxing. So I texted Tiffany again to let her know, like, okay, I've tried these things and these are not working. And so she gave me a couple more positions to try and said that she was hopping in the shower and come and should be there. And I knew she lived about an hour away. So I knew I had probably a good 2 hours before she was there. So I had tried all of that. Water broke at basically 11 p.m. and it was 2 a.m. And I was like, okay, I think I need to wake John up now because this starting to get to where I was really having to find, like by the end of the contraction, I was starting to moan. And I was like thinking to myself, I can't even time these. There's too much going on in my brain. Like once I feel it coming, my thought is not hit start on the phone, it was just, time it to where my breathing would go with the contraction. And so
which is totally fine because you don't have to time
That's
your
what
contractions.
Should.
You don't have to. People are obsessed with timing, and for some people it helps and it's totally fine. But if you don't want to time your contractions, you don't have to time your contractions.
Yeah. And it was super helpful because, well, number one, once I kind of handed the reins over to Tiffany, I didn't have to bother Maggie, like think about texting Maggie or my photographer anymore because there was already too much going on in my head. And
benefit of having a doula is that they do that stuff for you.
There's a plug. Yes. So it's 2:30 and I walk upstairs and right as I get ready to wake up my husband, a really hard contraction hit. And I remember like doubling over on the bed and like kind of like not like screaming or anything, but like I hit the bed and I was like, whoa. And he sat up like Tales from the Crypt lady and just whoop, like, are you okay? And I was like, fine, I'm in labor. My water broke 3 hours ago. And he was just like, he like got up and was, all right, what do I need to do? And I'm like, nothing, I don't think, So I just texted Tiffany, let her know kind of what I was feeling. They just kept getting more intense. And I'm thinking, at that point I was kind of already like, well, this is the route we're going, but wow, if this is this intense now, like, what is it going to be like later? That thought kind of went through my brain, but then another contraction was there and I had no time to think about like, how am I going to do this? Cause I was doing it, So basically Tiffany said, lay in the side lying, like exaggerated side lying position. And that felt good. And I think I laid there for the hour and a half, 2 hours that it took her to get to my house.
Good.
It felt fine. It was intense, but it was just like, I know she's going to make me move as soon as she gets here. So I think I'm just going to lay here for now. and sure enough, it was like 4 a.m. I think that you got there and we started doing like abdominal sifting and then the rebozo, like on my hips, on hands and knees. We did some where I was like holding up my belly, leaning up against the wall. And John did this, like kind of held up my belly and I leaned up against him for a while, did a couple contractions on the ball. And me and Tiffany were chatting about like how we decided to have a baby in the first place. My husband and I had been married for 6 years and we were kind of on the route of no kids. And then we decided, just not out of nowhere, but through, changes of events in our lives, that we were going to have a baby. So we were having this like,
by the way, guys, the most beautiful story ever. Like, I just want to plug that because it was awesome.
Yeah. So we're having this like super deep conversation. And then all of a sudden I just stopped talking. Like I was mid-sentence. I just stopped talking and John finishes the story and I could just tell like, okay, things are getting serious.
Yeah.
And I remember throughout telling Tiffany, I'm not having back labor. Like I was like adamant, I'm not having back labor because that means the baby's malpositioned, And I'm like, I just kind of feel some discomfort in my lower back. So she tried a couple different things, but we were both like, it's not intense. You're definitely not acting like somebody who has like back labor in the sense of like when it can be really, really intense. And I know Tiffany had back labor with her pregnancy. So she knew what it felt like, looked like, acted like. And we were just like, let's hop in the shower maybe. So get in the shower. And that felt amazing. Having the water hit my back. And she instructed me on different positions to do in the shower with my legs up and stuff. But I think that's where it like, I don't know if that was transition, but that was where it like really ramped up.
What time was this? Do you remember?
8 a.m. is
this
when.
Was, okay. Yeah. It was about 8:30.
Yeah. So I remember Victoria, the photographer, coming and I was like, okay, I'm getting really hot now. So we got out of the shower and I had a really hard contraction and had to like get down on my hands and knees right away. And then like all throughout, we're going to the bathroom every couple of times. And I just remember every few contractions, maybe every hour or so. And I remember sitting on the toilet was very intense. But it felt good to have that, change of position. And so we got up on the bed and I mean, I could hear Tiffany and Victoria kind of like chatting, but I was totally out of it by then. It was like contraction, water, contraction, water. Like it was just a routine.
So was the midwife and I'll tell
well, that's what I was going to say. So by this point I had already told Maggie like, hey, this is what's going on. Like, and at this point, whenever Holly's in the bed, it's just Victoria, the birth photographer, and myself, and then Holly's husband, John. And in my head, what is happening? Well, in Victoria and I, we're both thinking like, oh crap, this baby's going to come right now. Like that's how intense it was. That's what it appeared like. We really honestly thought that her midwife wasn't going to make it in time. So in the meantime, I'm texting the midwife saying like, hey, you need to get here as soon as possible. She tells me, well, my assistant is closer. She lives, much closer than Maggie does to Holly. So she's like, okay, she's on the way. Like she'll be there soon. So, okay, we're cool. We're good. Like we'll ride this out a little bit longer. Yeah. Go ahead, Holly.
Yeah. So I remember getting out of the shower and getting up onto the bed and we kind of do a couple contractions. I can't remember if we used the ball or if I was just hands and knees, but I remember saying like, I think I'm ready the water felt really good. I would like to get in the pool, but I don't want to get in too early. And Tiffany just kept saying, I don't think it's too early. I think maybe we could. And as soon as I was like, okay, I think I want to get in the pool, the assistant Megan came in and I could just feel like in hindsight, I could feel like the relief, like it kind of got a little more lighthearted then for a minute. Cause I mean, it felt like the contractions were right on top of each other. And I had no knowledge of when the midwife would come, or I knew I was going to start pushing. If my body told me to start pushing, I was just going to go for it. So yeah, Megan checked my vitals and everything. Everything looked great. She checked heart tones. They were down low. Like, obviously they were down low, but like, and actually, let me back up. When Maggie checked me, baby's position Thursday evening, head was down. She felt it down there and everything. And then she checked his heart tones and they were down low as well. Now, obviously he was engaged in my pelvis. So low is low at that point. And he was a tiny baby, 6 pounds, 13 ounces. So anyways, everything just seemed to be like, there was no idea. Yeah. There could have been a complication, you know? Yeah. So yeah, they started getting the pool ready. And at this point, you know, the main midwife, Maggie, is not there yet, but the assistant is. And so I hop in the pool. That feels great. And start doing my contractions. And they just keep going and keep going. And I remember saying, if it keeps up like this, I'm not sure how much longer I can do that. And Tiffany goes, that means he's coming soon. And I'm like, but like, how soon? I said. And she just
relative.
Yeah, she just like my arm and like lets me move on to the next thought or the next contraction before she has to like answer that question.
I'm just gonna avoid this question.
Yep. Yeah, because it could have been an hour or it could have been 5 hours.
Either way, that counts as soon in birth. Yeah, like, soon is relative.
Right, exactly. Yeah,
yes. So then the scariest part of the whole, you know, day starts. I can't exactly remember, and maybe Tiffany can help, but I remember doing a lot on my knees and kind of hanging over the birth pool. And I can't remember if like through general consensus, it was like, maybe we try a different position just because, you know, a good position could be helpful, you know? And so I remember rolling over and sitting on my back, and Maggie said, you know, he might have some trouble getting underneath your pubic bone. So if you could like pull up your legs during the next contraction and
because by this point you were pushing.
Yes. So
you were spontaneously bearing down like during your contractions.
Yes. And fluid, which I could just feel like things rushing out of me as I was spontaneously pushing, more water coming out or whatever. I could just feel things coming out. And so anyways, I get on my like butt essentially. And when that contraction hits and I try to pull my legs up, I'm like, this ain't happening. So it was kind of like a useless contraction in my head. I was like, I didn't do anything with that one.
It was intuitive.
Yeah. It just didn't feel good for me in that position. And so I rolled back over, I believe. And Maggie just kind of says, hey, Holly, with this next contraction, would you mind if I checked you? And I immediately look at Tiffany and I was like, why would she ask me that? You know, in my head, I'm thinking like, why would she ask me that? I don't want to be checked, but you know, lots of emotions. And Tiffany just kind of like nods, like has a little smirk on her face and like, I think that would be fine. Right. You know? And I was like, sure. Yeah. Let's get checked. You know, she's like, just so I can have an idea of what's going on. But I didn't hear that meconium was coming out of me. And so that's why she prompted to ask me, would I be able to check you? And I'm really glad that I have my people that were like, yes, that's a great idea.
And just for clarity, meconium is baby's poop coming out. And that is like heavy amounts of meconium coming out is like signature vaginal breech birth. Like it just like pours out.
It was like every single push she would bear down and more meconium would come out. And I don't know that this had necessarily been happening for a long amount of time. I don't think it had been. I feel like it had only been, you know, just a few contractions that we noticed that was happening.
Hey listener, do you want a comprehensive yet concise and inexpensive online at your own pace natural birth education course to help you prepare for natural birth, pregnancy, and postpartum? Then check out the description below for that and our helpful products guide. Now back to the show.
Yeah, I mean, I really think about it, and it was maybe like 2 or 3 I remember kind of doing on my hands and knees. And because you guys are all so intuitive, you were probably thinking, well, why isn't this baby down further? We can't even see him yet. I remember people kind of looking like, okay, Holly, let's change positions because maybe he's stuck on your pubic bone. If you change positions, maybe he'll just pop right, start to descend more. I think that everybody was assuming he was head down. And so then like after that, it was like a contraction or two and meconium was coming out. And so she checked me, but I was unaware that it was meconium. I remember seeing her like pick it up out of the pool, but I was out of it. I just didn't really realize what she was doing. And it was just like, if you had like the little record on a record player and you hear the little, it was like everything stopped. And she goes, I feel his butt. And it didn't even register to me. What does that mean? And she goes, he's flipped positions. I feel his butt. And I just started crying.
Yeah.
I'm like, what? Like, oh my gosh. And Maggie was so calm the whole time, but the look on everybody's face, was very concerning. And she, I'm continuing to have contractions. I would say they were probably every 2 minutes apart, maybe a little closer at this point.
Yeah. Yeah.
And she just said, I said, so what does that mean? What do we do? And she goes, well, typically I would transfer. She goes, but where we are located, it's going to take you X amount of minutes to get to the hospital that she has privileges at. I won't be able to come in. Your doula most likely won't be able to come in. You're going to have to drive yourself to the hospital because you're not in distress. Baby's heart tones are great. So he's not in distress. We're not going to order an ambulance over here. So I'm like, she goes, so you're probably going to end up having this baby in the car. She goes, but the risks of a breech birth here would be head entrapment. She goes, but I can feel him, Holly. He's a very small baby. I don't believe that that's going to be a problem. And then she kind of like, also, at first I felt like she was presenting it like, well, we're going to transfer, like there's no other option. But then I think as she was like talking it through, it was kind of like, she came to these conclusions of like, well, you're 30 minutes from the hospital. You're going to go get in a car and you're going to have to labor all alone when I've labored with people with me almost this entire time. And then I probably would have ended up, not probably, I absolutely would have ended up with a C-section unless he happened to come out in the car on the way to the hospital.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Maggie basically asked me, what do you want to do? And I had no idea. She kept giving me, all the pros, all the cons, all of the risks. And then I said, can John and I just talk this over ourselves? And she said, yeah, we'll step out for a minute. And then I grabbed Tiffany's hand. I'm like, but you need to stay.
Yeah.
Because I knew that I'm thinking my baby's life and my life. I need to protect that, but I'm thinking of that as like the highest priority, which obviously it is, but I wasn't thinking with like my natural mindset anymore. I was thinking my medical mindset, like this is an emergency. This cannot happen.
A lot of fear.
Yes. I was very scared. Like all of those contractions hurt way worse during that, like, it was probably three minutes, maybe 5 minutes of time that we spent making this decision, but it felt like an eternity. And so, Tiffany just gave me really like the more of the facts, but from a non-emotional state. And I don't ever know that I said, okay, I'm staying home, but
you didn't. You didn't.
I didn't. Yeah. So Maggie came back in and she's like, okay, if we're going to do this, you got to get out of the tub. And so it was just like, oh yeah, we're doing this. I never really said like no to the hospital transfer or yes to staying home. It just kind of happened. So yeah, we got up on the bed and it went pretty quickly from there. I don't know that it was an hour, maybe less.
No, probably like 30 minutes.
Yeah. And I was on my hands and knees for a few contractions, but he was moving, but he kind of was coming back up in the birth canal. He was coming down, but then he would go back up. And so they instructed me to kind of hike up one of my legs. And from there, man, he just like dropped and started coming out. Yeah. And it was awesome to like look. And I remember looking down and seeing because his testicles came out first and they were so swollen. Yeah. And then his butt and one of his legs dropped out. And I remember kind of like looking down and seeing him and between every single contraction I said, is he okay? Is he okay? Is he okay? Because I remember them checking him and checking his heart tones between every single contraction. And every time they reassured me that he was great. And I mean, it was 3, because we have a video of it. It was 3 or 4 pushes to get him out. And I mean, I don't remember ever really pushing. It was all physiological. It was just like, okay, here's another contraction.
That like fetal ejection reflex kicked in.
Yes. Yeah. And I remember rewatching the video, and it was like a minute and a half where his whole entire body was out of me from like his nipples up. And it was a minute and a half until my next contraction came before the whole rest of him came out. And I just think that's so neat that, you know, there was no pulling on him. There was no tugging on him. When he started to come out, watching the video, he did have the cord wrapped around his neck, but that was not an issue at all. It was just unwrap it. And he took a breath. I have the video, so I timed it one time. Like it took him 24 seconds to cry, but I mean, that's all normal.
Yeah.
So
totally normal. Yeah.
And then I rolled over and met my baby. It was
amazing.
Yeah.
Amazing.
It was beautiful.
And you were very intuitive. Like, I know you said at one point you had a lot of fear, and there was a lot of like, you know, there was a lot of fear happening, but you were able, you know, with Tiffany's help especially, but just in general, you were able to calm down and be intuitive and with different movements and everything. And I think that is so important with a vaginal breech birth, is that you're able to listen to your body and feel things within your body and respond and have freedom of movement. Easy freedom of movement is like one of the biggest keys with having a successful vaginal breech birth, which you found being able to hike that knee up is what made a difference.
Yeah. And I mean, even I was Tiffany's first breech birth. I was my midwife Maggie's first breech birth, the photographer, the midwife assistant, everybody's first. So that was insane.
I got a text like the next day from Maggie, and she was like, so I had this birth and my client flipped, you know, the baby flipped breech. And I was like, oh, bummer. Did you have to transfer? And she was like, no, we stayed home and it was amazing. And I just remember being so excited, like, for everything.
Yeah.
It was so awesome.
The shock on Maggie's face. I mean, she was all business, but like there is not like one instance in any photo the whole entire time out of anybody. There's no fear on anybody's face, which is just, there's fear in our faces and like concern right when we found out that he was presenting, you know, rump first. But after that, it was like everyone was committed. No one had any doubts. And the look on everybody's face when he came out was just like the most beautiful picture I've ever seen. Amazing. Everybody is just like mouth wide open, biggest smiles, like nothing like, oh, thank God that's over. Yeah. It was like, wow, that was the coolest thing ever. And that's exactly what Tiffany said. As soon as he came out, that's the coolest thing I've ever seen.
Yeah. Oh,
it was.
I remember my first vaginal breech birth, like so well. I just remember being like, wow, that was amazing.
Yeah. Well, and afterwards I did a lot more like reading on breech and how there are cardinal movements of a breech baby within the vaginal canal. And it was just like, wow, he really did. You could even see on the video how he did kind of rotate when he was coming out. And it was just wild that, you know, it's just a variation of normal and it's nothing to be afraid of right out of the gate. Obviously it can turn concerning at any point, but I'm just so thankful that it didn't.
And the key with vaginal breech birth, we talked about freedom of movement, but it's also being in the hands of a skilled provider, someone who understands the cardinal movements of vaginal breech birth, and someone who understands what maneuvers to do to help a baby who gets stuck. Just like with a head down baby, you know, care providers have to know how to manage a shoulder dystocia. It's, you know, they have to have those
skills. And I just want to interrupt for just a second, you know, because obviously none of us had ever experienced a vaginal breech birth in the home setting before. But when Holly and John and I, when it was just the three of us talking, and they were trying to come to a decision about, you know, like what was going to happen, were we going to transfer, were we not? I knew of a breech provider that lived in Illinois who, Maggie and Megan also knew. So, after that, after I had like said, hey, can you phone a friend, basically, they did, and they were in constant contact with her throughout the rest of the birth. So, although there wasn't like somebody there who had done it before, we were in contact with a provider who knew exactly what to do, who told, Maggie and Megan what to do, right, if XYZ occurred. So, yeah.
Yep. And
I wanted to make sure that got said too, because, and even like we're not worried, but being prepared for what could have happened afterwards. So I remember them saying like, we were prepared for you to hemorrhage. We were prepared for all of these things. And like, that's just so, that's something I don't think a lot of people know, is that home birth is just as safe, if not safer than the hospital. And they're just as prepared for every possible scenario.
Yeah.
And agreed.
It's awesome.
So I remember feeling afraid whenever we were making the decision, do I stay or do I go? But after that decision was made, or lack of decision, and just eventual getting out of the pool and getting up onto the bed, I don't remember feeling afraid of the scenario. Like I was asking constantly if Jeremiah was okay, my baby boy, Jeremiah. I was asking, is he okay? Is he okay between every contraction? But I don't remember feeling afraid that something bad was going to happen. I don't remember thinking this is not going to end well, because I think if I was afraid, my labor wouldn't have continued to go at the rapid pace it was going at.
Yeah. Right.
And so what time was he born?
11:23 a.m. So I was in labor for roughly 12 hours.
Yep. That's not too bad for a first time mama.
No, I feel like it was an answered prayer, but I know it's like unheard of.
Well, and breech babies tend to be born quickly. Like once it starts, like, and you're really in labor, it tends to go fairly quickly, especially pushing. I think because the rump comes first, right? And so it's a little bit smaller. So it kind of almost like paves the way, maybe. I don't know. Maybe I'm making that up, but that's just kind of my thought on it.
Yeah.
But 12 hours from waking up with maybe contractions, but your water breaking, to having a baby, and everything that happened in that 12 hours, man, like it picked up quickly. You thought it was so intense. You thought the midwife wasn't going to make it. Assistant makes it, midwife makes it, finds out your baby's, you're pushing, you find out your baby's breech, and you have to make this choice, and then you don't really make a choice, but then he's here and he's perfect and he's safe. And it was just like the perfect kind of easy peasy textbook vaginal breech birth, which is awesome.
Yeah.
It was beautiful.
Yeah. I remember looking and saying, I didn't even pack a hospital bag. And she goes, I just prepared for everything. Didn't even pack a hospital bag. I'm like, I didn't think I would need it.
You knew intuitively. Again, it's back to that intuition. You just used that mama's intuition that you have, that, it's so important, God-given, nature-given, however you want to think about it. But that intuition that all of us moms have, and you used it and you relied on it, and it just turned out so wonderfully.
Yeah. Well, and I just want to say too, the hospital that we would have transferred to if Holly and John had chosen to transfer, like Holly said earlier, it would have taken at least 30 minutes to get there. And then, because she was a home birth patient, we would have had to go probably through the ER, and they would have put her under general anesthesia, and she wouldn't have gotten to meet her baby for a few hours. And I think that's really important to point out because, obviously I know that does happen. People do transfer, and obviously that has happened before, but, we went from this like potentially very traumatizing scenario where Holly got put under general anesthesia and had her baby, cut out of her and not being able to meet her baby for 2 or 3 or 4 hours to like this very intuitive led, beautiful, peaceful birth where she was the first person to, to hold and touch her baby, and she got to nurse her baby immediately after the baby was born. And, I just think that that's beautiful.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I have goosebumps you saying that.
And considering the risks that it would have required to transfer, also, that's something that so many people don't think about is, yes, vaginal breech birth is slightly riskier than, cephalic head down breech birth, But when compared, there are risks to having a C-section too. And especially in your case, the added risks of being put under general anesthesia, that adds to the risk of the C-section and the birth itself. And you have to consider those too when you're considering if you want to do a C-section or a vaginal breech birth.
Well, and also, right, just having a primary C-section, number one. And then in the area that we live in, VBACs aren't something that everyone does. I mean, the VBAC rates are very low around here, especially in hospital, so I think also taking that into consideration is important as well.
Yeah. Well, and the even if she were to have a VBAC, a vaginal birth after a C-section, and now we're getting a little ahead of ourselves. This is with a potentially second baby, but the risks for the next baby that come with it being a VBAC too, you have to consider all of those long-term risks. And that's really where Breech Without Borders is coming in and saying like, yes, in the very short term, a C-section for vaginal breech birth is slightly safer for baby. But when you look at the long term and you look at side effects for mom as well, potential risks for mom as well, they really end up being quite equal, vaginal breech birth versus a C-section for a breech birth. And so you really have to trust that intuition like Holly did, where you are trying to be internal with it and deciding what's going to be best for you, because there's not necessarily a super clear answer. But
no, it didn't feel very clear whenever we were making it. It was like, I remember my husband saying, well, Holly, we have to protect Jeremiah. We have to go to the hospital. And I'm like, yes, that sounds like the right answer. That sounds like the logical answer that, 99% of the population would probably come to in this scenario, but it just didn't feel right at the moment.
Right.
And all of those things you guys are talking about were what was going through my head, which I feel like is not common either. And I knew I would get put under general if I didn't end up having the baby before we got there. And I knew this is like so all encompassing, these contractions and all of this. How am I going to change gears and be the one who has to grab my baby and make sure he's okay and do all of that all by myself in the back of a car with my husband driving? That didn't seem like a great scenario. And then, thinking about if I go under general, I won't be able to breastfeed. What's that going to do to our relationship? I won't be able to breastfeed right away. What's that going to do to our breastfeeding relationship? I was thinking about him missing out on all of those great, not antibiotics, like a bacterial exposure that he gets in the vaginal canal, the squeeze that he was getting, even though it's different in a breech birth versus a head down birth. I just was like, all of these things are the things that I want for him. And that's going to be great for him in the long term. I'm going to miss all of that if I just go transfer to the hospital right now and not really think this through.
And honestly, you guys, for everyone listening, like all of these thoughts were happening in a span of like 5 minutes.
Yes.
Like from the time that Maggie checked Holly's cervix and realized that Jeremiah was butt down to the time she got in the bed was probably no longer than 7 minutes. Like it happened so quick.
But it probably felt like forever too.
It did. I remember kind of kicking myself after it was all over. Like I should have rethought through this whole entire scenario and prepared for it before I had a baby. But then I thought, no, because in preparation for this, had I asked my midwife, what would you do if he flips breech? She would have said, we transfer. And so I would have already had that preconceived notion of like, Maggie doesn't want to do this, can't do this, whatever it was. But ever since I've had this vaginal breech birth with Maggie and Tiffany and the photographer, Victoria, they've had another one shortly after mine, and they've done a ton of work with breech providers and taking classes and doing all sorts of things just to get more education, which just seems like so cool that Jeremiah started all of this.
Yeah. That's what I was going to say. That was going to be my next thought, Holly, is that like you really opened the doors for other families, around here. There isn't really any providers that will do vaginal breech birth, let alone vaginal breech birth at home. And I know that that's not something that like, Maggie and, Maggie's associates are like trying to do all the time. Right. However, I think it's really important to know that like, if it does happen again, where it is a surprise, that it's not an emergency, So that's because of you.
Yeah.
It's not something I would have like signed up for. Like, hey, put me on.
Right.
on my to-do list.
Yeah.
But it is really, really neat to think of in hindsight.
Yeah. I know. I remember even at your postpartum visit, sitting on the nursery room floor and we're talking, and I was, just telling you like how amazing this is. And then I was like, like, okay, maybe this was a little bit traumatizing for you, Holly, but like, it was so cool. Like, you are such a badass,
right?
Like, not many people can say that this has happened to them.
Yeah, that's awesome. I just think it's so cool how like all those little pieces just kind of fit together. And then it just worked out awesomely for you. And let me ask you this.
Yeah.
If you had another baby and you knew baby was breech ahead of time, would you choose to go to the hospital or would you opt to stay home?
I would opt to stay home 100%, as long as I can have my doula there and yes. They're instrumental in the whole grouping. Like I couldn't have done it without them. I mean, obviously they just helped me trust my body more. And in turn, I saw them trusting my body. And so I trusted my body more. It was just, John and I talked about that. I said, what if the next one is breech too?
Yeah.
And he said, well, you want to go to the hospital? And I said, no.
Well, and there are a lot more breech trained providers now who offer home birth in our area. A lot of the local home birth midwives now have taken the training, or we have a Breech Without Borders training. As of the recording, we have it coming up like in a week.
In
like a week, a bunch more of us are going to be trained or retrained in the whole process. So it's just really awesome to me that it's coming more to our area. For the listeners who don't know, it's the St. Louis, Missouri area. But there's just a lot more of us being prepared, even if we don't plan on taking it all the time, being prepared for that emergency and that surprise vaginal breech birth. Because
Rachel, that's what I was going to say. That's the whole reason why I'm taking the training, because, obviously the training has been set up for a long time. And I'm like, no, I don't need to take the training. Like, I'm just a doula. It's not important. Like, I'm just there for support until, Rachel pointed out to me, like, that you've been the only person at births before. Like, you've been the one to catch a baby. So what happens if the midwife doesn't make it in time? And, the same thing happened to Holly, where her baby flipped to breech, during labor or right before labor or whatever. And I'm the only one there, you know? And then I was like, okay, maybe I should take this training.
Yeah, because as doulas who attend a lot of home births, like we've both been the only person there because baby came so fast and it wasn't planned that way, but it happened. And, just to be extra prepared and extra safe, like, I mean, doulas, if you're listening, I guess this is just my pitch to tell you all that if you have the opportunity to take a Breech Without Borders training, take it. And any of those types of trainings, because sometimes you do accidentally end up being the only one there.
Well, and even
it's happened to me on more than one occasion.
And moms too. Moms can take it too.
Yeah, moms too.
Take the same training. Yeah. Parents.
Well, and I mean, just like I said, I had no intentions of my baby being breech, and then he was. So
you never know.
I just anecdotally, I was listening to another podcast where the provider is a doctor and he strictly does breech, like specializes in that.
Is that Dr. Stu?
Yes.
We love Dr. Stu. Woohoo. Yeah.
So I listened to a couple of his podcasts about how breech is not an emergency. And I thought, oh, this is nice because I had a long drive. I'll just listen to it. And okay, that's neat for you people who are going to have breech babies, you crazy nuts. And now I'm one of them. So I'm just thankful that I did, even just like, just to tickle my interest. I'm going to listen to one or two podcasts on it. And so I did know whenever she said he was breech, like, this feels like an emergency, but I know that it doesn't have to be. So just a piece of education.
And from my perspective, God put all these pieces together for you because you even said at the beginning, like, you didn't ask about position change if baby turned to breech. Like, you didn't even ask that. It wasn't even something like, almost like intuitively you knew not to ask that.
Yeah.
And then like,
you don't want to know the answer.
And then you listen to this breech podcast thinking you're never going to need it. And then you did, and that little piece was put there. And then you happen to have, you switched to that home birth and you happen to have a midwife, or you had a doula who knew a midwife who was breech trained. So when it came up, you were able to have that support on the phone still, just in case that it was even needed. But like, I mean, it's just all of these little pieces that just, fall into place just the way God does things. It's just so funny.
If Tiffany hadn't continued to bring up home birth, every time I would share with her, hey, these are a couple more of my birthing preferences. This is 14 weeks, 18 weeks. Like, I think I hired Tiffany around like my 9th or 10th week.
Yeah, maybe. It was pretty early.
It was pretty early, but so I texting her my preferences. And when we did Zoom calls and stuff, she's like, I really think you should, she kept sending me Maggie's home birth information. I really think you should check out home birth. I really think you should call Maggie and just talk to her. And I'm like, no, it'll be fine. I'll go to the hospital, but had she not continued to share that with me because of her own convictions, like, I wouldn't have chosen a home birth. Most likely I would have just been, let's go ahead. And because she's the one who put it in my head, not, I saw videos, I listened to podcasts, but I thought that's not something that's feasible for me. I've never heard of anyone doing that around here. But then whenever she said, this is an option, I think people don't realize it's an option. And then now that I know, I'm just so thankful, because had I not even entertained it as an option per suggestion, I would have wound up with a C-section 100%, because I would have been in the hospital anyways.
Yeah. It's crazy.
Just thankful for Tiffany for so many reasons.
I love it.
I'm just so happy that I could be there. I mean, it was just amazing. It would have been beautiful and amazing anyway, but obviously because of the situation, it made it even more so, and the fact, honestly, I'm being selfish here. The fact that, it was with some of my best friends, that made it even more cool,
Right.
Yeah.
And I know that we're going way over time, but I did want to say, I'm not sure that we'll ever know the reason why he flipped breech, but when he came out, he did have the cord wrapped around his neck once. And so after talking with Tiffany and Maggie and just kind of being like, why do you think this happened? He was head down 7 p.m. Thursday night, and he was born at 11:30 on Friday morning. Why would this have happened? And the thought is that he was a very active baby, constantly moving. And I do feel like a few times, especially in the last trimester, he kind of was oblique. He maybe even felt transverse for a day or two. My belly just looked really funny. And I didn't have an appointment with Maggie at the time. And so I couldn't really clarify or verify that he was transverse, but he always went back to where he was supposed to be. And the thought is that because the cord was wrapped around his neck and maybe where the umbilical cord was inserted into the placenta, like he couldn't engage and fully go head down. It was putting too much tension on the cord. And so he took the path of least resistance, flipped, and came out feet first or butt first instead. So.
Yeah. And that's really important too, in our culture, specifically, like we don't give enough credit to the babies and like the potential reasons why babies are in the positions that they choose to be born in. All that to say, babies are really, 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 really smart. Yeah. So we need to give them more credit for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I always say, if you've done all the things and baby stays breech or flips breech last minute, there is a reason. And, in the case of a hospital birth, you may have been offered an in-labor ECV, an external cephalic version. You may have just been rushed to a C-section. But either way, an ECV is an okay option if it's your only option. But in your case, you had other options. And it's so awesome that being at home, you were able to just trust your baby and what he knew he needed for his birth.
Yeah. And the coolest thing was that, they assessed the situation. They knew that there was no imminent harm at the moment. His vital signs were great. My vital signs were great. And my labor pattern didn't change at all. So those are all really important pieces. If any of those things would have gone awry, my vital signs were a problem, his were a problem, or my labor was stalling, obviously a transfer would have been the safest option, but none of those things were happening. So in Maggie's knowledge of birth and then consulting, I guess, with the lady who does breech around here and just everybody else's knowledge of the situation, they were like, there's no reason. Why would we transfer her? It was kind of like light bulb. Why would we transfer her?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
Well, and
everything
Tiffany
is safe.
and Victoria and Maggie all have Team Breech t-shirt. It says their own little inside joke.
Because of Holly's birth. Like, it's because of that. Because we were all so shocked that it happened. And yeah.
You
now,
had to commemorate
Team
it
Breech.
somehow.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
I love it.
So funny. Well, thank you so much, Holly, for coming on today and sharing your beautiful story. We are so appreciative, and we really hope that, lots of people hear your story. And, really our main goal when we talk about breech birth is, Rachel and I both, we just want people to know that it is a variation of normal. It's nothing to be scared of. So,
you have choices. You have choices, even if you can't confidently actually officially make a choice in the moment.
Yeah, right.
Well, yes. Thank you guys so much for having me. I really enjoyed talking about my birth story. It's always fun to relive it.
I am so grateful that you were happy to share it. And hopefully it's really going to help some of the listeners out there, doulas or mamas, whoever's listening, they're going to get some good nuggets.
Yep.
All righty. Well, thank you again for being on, guys. And listeners, if you have any questions, you can email me at contact@thenaturalbirthsite.com, or you can reach out to me or Tiffany on our social media at The Natural Birth Site. And we're happy to answer any questions. But until next time, guys, thanks for listening.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Hi, Rachel Manns again. If you want to learn more, please subscribe to and rate this podcast, and head over to thenaturalbirthsite.com to check out our online natural birth education course, birth story blog, YouTube channel, and more.